All right, we are live. I'm Father James, and this is the Barely Protestant YouTube channel. So, I was literally debating up to like 5 minutes before whether I should actually do a sort of full like video response, kind of like looking at it and going over the video, or just sort of generically responding. So I wrote notes. And really mostly focused upon the video itself. I decided, you know what, let's go through the video. So this is a video response to Dr. Gavin Ortlund's "How Did Low Church Get Uncool," um, which is a very interesting title for it. I might want to ask him about that exactly, but I'm going to let you all know this. If you know me and know the channel much, you'll know this. I grew up in a very fundamentalist Baptist sort of worldview. That my dad was a Baptist pastor. I born and raised within that tradition. Dedicated as a baby rather than baptized, all that fun stuff, right? I did not become Anglican. I did not leave the sort of general sort of Baptist world until 2012. Yeah, 2012. Well, 2013 was when I got confirmed, but 2012 is when I was sort of like really discovering Eastern Orthodoxy, for instance, and then became Anglican the next year instead of Eastern Orthodox. Anyway, so yeah, let me sort of like I want to go through um this video, obviously, but I do want to preface it with a few things. So the first thing I think is really important is that um when he's talking about like the sort of issues that like he's sort of distinguishing his complaint about the whole how evangelicals are treated. He calls them low church. I think a better term would be sort of modern American evangelical. Some people will complain with that term evangelical because a lot of Lutherans love it, or have loved it historically. Um, for the sake of our purpose here, um, I'm going to understand low church as evangelical. And the reason is that, technically speaking, we wouldn't call like Baptists as worshiping today. When you think of your typical Baptist church, we wouldn't think of that as low church. Um, Contemporary worship is not low church. Low church is a very specific type of liturgical worship. Really, contemporary is just this really new thing. Um, I'm not sure exactly how to categorize it. A bit of charismaticism, and I'm not even necessarily speaking theologically, although there's an element of that too. Uh, a lot of entertainment and all that sort of stuff. It's just a very different sort of animal. So I'm going to be using the term evangelical. I'm just understand that what I mean by that is when people think of by that, the non-denominational Baptist sort of tradition. So he's saying like you might have actual concerns about the evangelical Baptist sort of tradition, but the arrogance and the sort of thumbing your nose kind of thing at them, all that sort of stuff is, he's saying, unnecessary. Whoa, we already have actually a lot of messages. I'll look at those in a bit later. Um, oh wait, actually, I just read this. Yeah, this is gonna be kind of my point. Henry Long. I don't know. Maybe sometimes we aren't hard enough. The evangelical extremes are very popular and influence the middle, right? Yeah. So he points out like, hey, can we stop dunking on Baptists, because I'll be using Baptist as well. I'll say Baptist evangelical. I don't want to keep saying Baptist evangelical non-denominational. So if I say Baptist, if I say evangelical, if I say non-denominational, just understand this is what I am talking about, what he is sort of defending here, right? So he goes, hey, can we not have this sort of you know arrogance towards this other tradition, all that sort of stuff? They've done a lot of good and all that sort of stuff. And so we're going to be dealing with that. He does get into the theology later as well, sort of giving a defense on it. And I'm going to give some of my answers to that as well. But, so understanding all this, uh, I do want to say, I do believe that evangelicals are brothers in Christ. I do believe that there can be an arrogance that happens. Um, we'll get into some of those points as well. But I will say just right now, by far, it's the other way around, like without question. Like one of the most arrogant groups is the sort of modern American evangelical group. So I think that's just not questionable. I mean, very, very often you hear of people, and I've seen this, I've experienced it. When when I went from my Southern Baptist church, at this point I was Southern Baptist, right? And I'd been going to the Saturday night vespers uh, for the Eastern Orthodox for about a year at that point, and I decided ultimately that's not for me. So I stopped going, but I was still going to my Baptist church pretty much every Sunday. Sometimes I would go to Divine Liturgy and all that, but pretty regularly I would go to my Southern Baptist church. I was teaching a class and all that sort of stuff. I was heavily involved in like the college group and everything. And when I started talking to my friends about uh, switching over to becoming Anglican, um, I was basically dropped like a hot thing that should be dropped when you are holding it without gloves. In fact, I wasn't arrogant about it. I wasn't, like, oh, Baptist theology is wrong, because I was still struggling with a lot of the like infant baptism, for instance. I was struggling with that sort of stuff. And essentially pretty much all of my friends from that Southern Baptist church dropped me. Yeah, there were other problems too. I just like there was a lot of issues with that sort of Southern Baptist church, but like this is a very common thing I've seen where um okay, I'll give another example. Just this morning, I was at a I want to be careful with this. So I love them, and if any of you brothers are watching this, I'm not trying to be whatever. It's a public thing, so it's not like it's private. But like, there was there's an event I go to on Wednesday mornings, and it's a lot of Baptists who are there. I'm the only non-Baptist, basically, or non sort of evangelical, whatever you want to call it. And um, like I'm thankful they've always been nice to me, right? But I'm still this sort of I'm still different from their theology. So like they have their different. I don't want to get into it. Never mind. We'll drop that anyway. So um, getting back to where we are. So here's my whole point. My whole point is like there is arrogance, that there can be arrogance. It's a cage stage thing. Everyone deals with it. It's not something unique, right? And in fact, my point is that it is far more common coming from the evangelicals to the liturgical traditions. So we're going to go ahead and go over this video, and we'll go into more detail as we sort of move through it.
That low church traditions seem to be getting more uncool these days, more than usual. I'm really curious if I'm the only one who notices this, or if others have put in the comments if you sense this. Basically,
so I do want to point out it's really odd, the whole uncool thing. I'm not. I'm very curious as to why he chose the term uncool. But there's like so much that can be unpacked in so many different ways with that. So yeah,
basically, a kind of becoming trendy to look down on Baptists, non-denominational Christians, other expressions of low church evangelicalism. It seems like actually there's a growing tension within Protestant circles between the high church traditions that have more of an emphasis upon tradition and liturgy, like Anglicanism, Episcopalianism, Lutheranism, some forms of Methodism and Presbyterianism, versus the low church expressions. Now, I'm not talking about disagreement or concern. I'm talking about an attitude towards low churchism, let's call it that, that goes beyond disagreement into kind of contempt and disdain, as though these Christians were sort of, I don't know, this odious, disgusting thing. I mean, that's putting it a little strong.
Right. So yeah, I think it is a bit strong. The idea that we have like this disgust towards evangelicals and such. Although I will say, I think some of it's merited. So going back to what Henry said here, what's the second one here? I know evangelical churches in my former denomination which adopted the worship block model, 30 minutes of singing before the sermon. Yeah. there is such a in evangelicalism, there's a reason that I get personally, like I get very, and I will say this far maybe, yeah, I'll say it, like I get disgusted with some of how evangelicals act, and my primary disgust is in their worship. I find it you can see it so many times in like evangelical sort of like videos of like these non-denominational churches and all that sort of stuff. There is this rock concert with a TED Talk mindset. Now, Gavin Ortlund actually has a video, actually a few videos, I think, but I know at least one where he sort of is like saying, "Yeah, this is bad stuff." I go, "This is pretty bad. Like, this is really, really bad. This is the shifting of focus from worshiping God to entertaining us." And that can't just be like a trifle difference, right? Um, Also, there are just fundamental differences in the sacraments, right? To the point where the Baptist position is quite offensive. It has to be. Well, not necessarily has to be, but typically, almost 100% of the people who are Baptists, a vast majority, I'll say that, a super majority of people who are Baptists, would say that an infant baptism is not a valid baptism. Now, also, baptism doesn't do anything for most of the people, and he's going to get into that argument and stuff like that as well. But like, this is offensive to us. We're like, no, this is how you're made part of the family of God. You literally don't think that your children should be part of the family of God, and they say, well, no, that's not what we believe it is, and it goes back and forth. But like, this is a fundamental shift. So the example I give, and I've given this one a few times, is suppose that we are building a house, right? And we have been left the blueprint from the architect, and like we need to follow this architect's blueprints to the letter, right? So after a few months or whatever of working on the house, some of the builders start getting into debates on, well, wait a minute, is this the living room or is this the TV room or is they the same? Like not insignificant things, right? But certain things, right? Should is this wall supposed to be this or that? All that sort of stuff, right? Then the Baptists come in, right? And they're like, oh, you see, every single sink is supposed to be able to have enough room to plunge an entire body into it, because every sink is actually really a shower. It's supposed to be, or a bathtub. Every sink should be a bathtub. That's what it should be. When the light, when the architect says that the light should come in, what the architect is really meaning is that a representation of the light should come in. So what we need to do is keep these windows black, spray paint them black or cover them up, and then paint glitter on the inside so that it reflects light, because it's really just a representation of light. It's not the actual light. Why would you want the actual light to come in? It's just the representation of the light. Like, so that sort of stuff, right? There gets to a point where it's just like, dude, you're either helping us build this house or you're not. Now, that might sound very harsh, but it's very true. All right. I Baptist theology fundamentally cannot be, and this is going to be harsh, and I really am not trying to be mean about this, right? Baptist theology, by its very nature, cannot be reformed, right? Yeah, I've talked about this before. There's a difference between reformation and restoration, right? When the very foundation of the church is still intact, right? But we're sort of like worried about like the sort of things internally within, that's more of a reform, right? Um, when you're saying the foundation is no longer there or is corrupted, has been corrupted beyond all measure kind of thing, that's when it's a restorationist movement. That's when it's the Church of Christ, Mormons, all these sorts of things, right? Seventh-day Adventists. Baptists, when they are denying that the vast majority of people who have been baptized as infants, right, they're denying their baptism, and then they deny baptismal regeneration on top of that, right? When you're denying both, and these are both historic positions of the church, baptismal regeneration is without question the universal position of the church for all of early church history until the 1500s. When you're constantly rejecting the foundations, when you go to a congregationalist mindset, when you don't have a standard confessional statement, when you're rejecting all of these things, it's like, you're a Christian by your baptism, but you are really trying hard to get rid of everything else that is not part of the historic Catholic Church. Like, you're really trying hard. And I'm please, can you at least work with us a little bit? And that's where the arrogance comes in with Baptist theology. And I hate being harsh on this, but we have to be real about it too. The Baptist theology is telling the entire church, guys, you just got everything wrong. Just about everything wrong. Until we came in. Or at least, the crowd, the little, Baptists hiding in the mountains, throughout, 1500 years of church history, all that sort of stuff, right? I'll give another example. I was having a debate with somebody on social media who was arguing that Lazarus is the one who wrote the gospel according to St. John. And my argument was like, no, like our patristic witness is that it was St. John. Like that's not the argument from the early church. Like, we're talking about people in the 2nd century who are saying that this is St. John's gospel, right? I think Papias is one who says that. The Muratorian Fragment is one that says that. I want to say St. Irenaeus. I think Polycarp as well, St. Polycarp. And I don't remember exactly who. Just, if I got one or two of those wrong, forgive me. But like, it is there in the early church, in the 2nd century, 3rd century, etc. And there was just this hand wave dismissal. Like, no, I don't care. That is the Baptist mindset. Like, it doesn't matter if literally every single person in church history prior to you individually says X. If you believe that the scriptures say Y, it doesn't matter. And like that maybe that's hyperbolic, but it's not very, very hyperbolic. That's why you see the Baptists are the ones who so easily caught on to the whole rapture dispensationalism thing, even though nothing unique to dispensationalism was sort of believed at all by the early church or anyone before that, right? So there is an arrogance that is tied to Baptist theology, which is very upsetting. And so maybe that might be some of the frustration, right? Where the frustration comes from this sort of like, can you stop trying to reinvent the wheel every single time? Well, that's not quite the right term. Reinventing the faith, yeah, and making new theology and just like constantly innovating and making new things up and all that sort of stuff. It's just like it's like, can we have a faith that's passed down? Not a faith that's constantly revised. And it's tied to this whole semper reformanda thing, right? I really just detest that phrase. I'm not sure the origins of it or the original intent of the origins of that term, but the way semper reformanda has been sort of understood is really just like constant revolution. It's a constant revolution, right? Let me give an example, right? If I'm just going to look at the witness of, say, the scriptures itself, right? Given my modern context, I would be, and I was, like, very persuaded. Okay, the Blessed Virgin had other children after Jesus that she had through marriage with her husband, right? Um, But the patristic witness is strongly against that position. So I'm going to submit to that position, um, precisely because I am trying to be humble and not rock the boat and constantly reinvent things. Because what's going to happen? An example of this, right? Saint Ignatius of Antioch, right? Very strong on having an episcopate. What does Calvin do? Calvin's like, oh, well, his stuff is spurious, or just like kind of dismisses him, right? Well, there are some letters of Saint Ignatius, of the 14 letters, right, that were, and you can see by video with Dr. Stephen Boyce on that, right, that are spurious, but the 7 are authentic. Um, and just like constantly dismissing actual historical reality, only to then have to make new arguments to defend your position that you did, because in part because you rejected what the historical witness said, because you thought it was fake. Like, you're just constantly having to do that. It's very problematic. So yeah.
But you know, this kind of vibe against them, like they're this unsophisticated, ignorant, kind of not good for much kind of thing. Now, the same thing happens in the other direction. The low church traditions often look at the high church traditions with more than just mere disagreement, but with a kind of contempt. Usually here, it'll be more like they're hypocrites, they're Pharisees, they're formalists, they're stuck in their traditions, they're relying upon outward ceremonies, and they don't have an inner heart to what they're doing, and so on and so forth. But I think the condescension in this direction toward the low church traditions is having a moment right now. And again, I'm curious if that's just anecdotal to me or if other people see that. Let me know. But I think the body of Christ is stronger when we give arguments for our views without the contempt. So you know, crank up the logic and argumentation, make all your arguments, appeal to the church fathers, do everything like that, but reduce the contempt. And therefore,
So I agree. I do think that like having contempt for the person himself is not good, right? So I've had lunch with Dr. Gavin Ortlund. He and I, for a brief time, lived in the Nashville area at the same time. He and I moved there about the same time, and then I moved here to get to uh, South Carolina for this parish position. Great guy, very humble. I wouldn't consider him arrogant. I wouldn't consider him evil or anything like that, right? He's a brother in Christ. But it is his Baptist theology that I think is incredibly problematic, right? And I don't mean his Baptist theology as opposed to another person's Baptist theology. I think Baptist theology itself is arrogant for the reasons I gave before, right? So I have a great dislike for Baptist theology because it is such a divisive and untrue approach to the Christian faith. It doesn't have a care for ecclesiastical unity. Like, by its very nature, it's congregationalist, right? Congregationalist is not ecclesiastical unity. Congregationalist is like worse than confederations, you know, as far as unity is concerned, right? It makes an argument against uh like it tries to argue that the baptisms of the historic church are not valid, and that the basic Baptist theology, the basic soteriology, the basic ecclesiology, all these things wrong. But I've already gotten over that, so let's continue on.
I want to speak to this. Let me start with an observation from John Newton. He said, self-righteousness can feed upon doctrines as well as works. I think about that quote a lot. I think it's so true. And I think it's true for church traditions as well. I think it's possible to feel self-righteous about which Christian tradition we belong to. So if you remember the Pharisee in Luke 18 who prays, God, I thank you that I'm not like those other people. I fast and I tithe and I do these various things. See a contemporary analog to that. We can say, God, I thank you that I'm not like those odious non-denominational Christians. I worship with traditional liturgy, beautiful architecture, clerical vestments, high view of the sacraments, et cetera, et cetera. Again, it can go in the other direction. People can be kind of contemptuous of those who do have those things. But how do we?
So note though, so that parable I think is very important, because the man who is being looked down upon, right, is in sin, right? And he repents of his sin. Okay. So the arrogant Pharisee who's looking down at the other person, right, is in sin for his arrogance. But he's actually not like wrong about like, well, this man is not fasting. This man is not doing like it's not. Here's what I want to avoid. The parable is not in sort of applying it to today's terms. The high church Anglican and the evangelical non-denom Baptist and the high church Anglican is like, Lord, I thank you that I'm not like this person. And then the evangelical is like, Lord, thank you so much for this rock concert. It's awesome. I just want to praise you with my rock concert. The evangelical is like supposed to be, God forgive me for my sin. So if that parallels, it doesn't quite work the way I think Gavin might be wanting to push it. Again, I don't think it's a perfect parallel, right? Because I do think that even if we're arrogant, right, and yes, we can be arrogant, we're pointing to something that is an actual issue. Again, the Pharisee himself is pointing to something that is an actual issue, which is this man is not fasting. This man is not observing the calendar. This man is not, doing all these other things. Yes, he's being arrogant, but also the other man is repenting of his sin. So yeah.
We know when we're falling into this. I think the key, we know when we're having self-righteousness about our distinctives, when we have contempt for other people. And the reason I say that is because of how Jesus introduces this parable for those who trusted in themselves that.
Hey, Kevin. Yes, I live in Spartanburg. That's where my church is. It's St. Francis Anglican Church in Spartanburg. So if you are moving near Greenville, please, yeah, that'd be awesome. I'd love for you to come.
They were righteous and treated others with contempt. You can see on the screen there what I've underlined and put in bolded. Contempt often reveals self-righteousness. How you treat other people reveals what kind of gospel you're functionally working with. The horizontal reveals the vertical, the social reveals the theological, etc. It's a fascinating thing to think about. And we always want to test our hearts with this. So while we're stating our disagreements, whenever we get into contempt, we want to just be open to asking the Lord to help us repent and go back to Christ alone for our justification. Now, in light of all this, what I want to do in this video is share a particular way that I see low church tradition.
I'm not going to try to. I just want to go through some of these really quickly. Father James, best book or video to send to a friend who doesn't understand infant baptism. He is in a Reformed Paedo Baptist church. Signed, sealed, and delivered by Bishop Ray Sutton is a really good book. As far as videos, I mean, you can watch videos that I've done. Dr. Cooper with his Just and Sinner videos does a lot of good Baptist stuff. Dr. Gavin Ortlund has a good talk with a two-part talk with Dr. Jordan Cooper on this, and he's going to link to it later. Yeah, like plenty of things like that. Yeah.
Being criticized, where I think it leads to the contempt. I think it's an unfair way of appraising this whole sector of Christianity, which actually right now is doing a lot of good for the kingdom of God, by the way. I'll say more about that at the end. Now, there's a lot of valid criticisms of it as well. Let me, if it helps at all, as a Baptistic person,
I really think this is an important thing to bring up with Kev. When I attended a non-denominational church, I soon stopped attending in person and only online because why get dressed? Get my kids dressed and use gas when I could do the same thing from home. That brings up a major, I think, fundamental issue with the particularly Baptist sort of theology. Maybe not particularly, because I think it also is a problem with a lot of the sort of Presbyterian stuff too. I think you can also have that when the sacraments don't have an objective efficacy, then they eventually, and we're going to get into this in a bit, they eventually have to become just a symbol. Like that, like it ends up having to have to be that.
I don't fit in very well among Baptists. No one attacks me more than Baptists. And because I'm, a lot of Baptists are very sectarian, and I'm a little, I would say I'm sort of moderately ecumenical, and I just don't fit in well culturally among some Baptists.
I do want to point out that it is interesting that he's pointing out like no one attacks me more than Baptists, and I go like that's kind of my point. Like the actual hatred for other Christians tends to come from the Baptists, from the evangelicals, even like your non-denominational sort of like whatever. I've had non-denoms attack me for being quote too ritualistic, that I'm not filled with the Spirit, because I do liturgy. It's a constant thing that happens. Um, it's yeah,
I love church history and
vain
Latin.
repetition.
Not exactly the things you think of with Baptists. So I get a lot of the concerns. Again, I'm not saying we shouldn't offer criticisms. I have criticisms of the low church traditions, but there's some unfair ones that lead to the contempt. Let me identify one here, trying to identify this sector of Christendom a little bit. And that is when we criticize, let's put it like this, we appraise a tradition by what is most visible rather than its official or best expressions. We just look at the surface anecdotally of what shines out, what is most apparent, rather than going to the official or best articulations and expressions of this tradition. Let me explain this by two metaphors. Metaphor number one: suppose you grow up in Minnesota. I grew up vacationing in Minnesota. I like Minnesota. It's a cool place. Really interesting and unique place. So you grow up in Minnesota and you know a lot of liberal Lutheran churches. In fact, let's just say that you only meet Lutherans who are liberal, as sometimes happens in places like that. And so you just think Lutherans are liberal because that's what you can see. Now, that's a somewhat understandable error because it's based in a real experience, albeit a limited one. But if somebody tells you about official Lutheran doctrine and other expressions of Lutheran Christianity that are more conservative, you should be willing to revise your understanding from that anecdotal picture to get the fuller picture. And if you're unwilling to do that, it could be a form of prejudice. Second example: suppose you grow.
All right, so let's deal with that first example. All right, so here's the problem. Lutherans have a formal doctrine, a set of confessions, right? Or a confessional standard, I should say, the Book of Concord. Anglicans, we have the 39 Articles. Yes, there are some Anglicans who don't hold the 39 Articles. There are questions about certain ones of the 39 Articles. There's like a bit of nuance with it all. But we have a confessional standard, right? We call it the Anglican formularies. So it's the prayer book. It is the 39 articles, and it is the books of homilies, and they sort of mix together and they become our confessional standards. Are we loose? Have we been loose? Yes, there's been that issue, and precisely like that is what causes problems, right? St. Louis affirmation is another one, by the way. But we do have a confessional standard, and when we don't hold to our confessional standards, or standard, we have problems, right? It causes problems. Baptists don't have that. Like there isn't. The closest you get is like the 1689 London Baptist Convention. That's the one I hear the most often, right? Or maybe the what's that one in the SBC, Word and Faith or something like that? It's called. I don't remember what it's called. Baptist Faith and Message, right? But these are not things that people hold to. Like Baptists hold to, like sort of on a universal level, and there is this, like, you can take it or leave it kind of thing. I know plenty of people who are just like, well, I'm a 1689 guy. I don't want this or that, or it's very loosey goosey, right? What is a Baptist supposed to believe? There are so many, different types. And here's the problem. Oh, the there isn't like this Baptist country, right, where you've got like, here's the standard of what Baptists believe, right? Or this sort of there's no standard for it. It's just which is the point I'm getting at. It's not something that is that there's a coherent theology. It is very much a reinterpretation, I'll say, of sola scriptura into a sort of what's called solo scriptura or nuda scriptura, and just sort of dividing into its, or sort of redefining everything into its own sort of perspective. If that makes sense. I don't know how clear I am being with that. Let's move on.
Grow up in Brazil, and your experience of Roman Catholicism is that it is very nominal. In fact, so much so that you don't know any devout Roman Catholics, and you don't know that they really exist. You just think Roman Catholics are nominal because that's been your observation, that's been your experience in the particular village you live in. Now, that's a somewhat understandable error because it's based upon a real experience, albeit a limited one. But if somebody comes along and says, "Hey, that's not the full picture. There's a little more to the story here," and so on and so forth, you should be willing to revise your understanding. Okay, that's the kind of thing I want to say about Baptists and low church Christians. Baptists are the most common kind of Protestant in the United States. And so what a casual observer just picks up anecdotally about Baptists in the United States in the 21st century can have similar dynamics to what a casual observer of Lutheranism in Minnesota or Roman Catholicism in Brazil. I'm not trying to pick on those two. You could do this anywhere. You could go to Eastern Orthodox somewhere in Eastern Europe. You can go to any tradition and do this. Whenever something is very visible, it's easy to just look at, oh, there it is, and now you think you've got the whole thing. But unfortunately, sometimes people seem like they're unwilling to revise their sort of anecdotal experience and observation of Baptists and other low church expressions of Christianity by just incorporating the fuller picture. And so we end up treating Baptists kind of like the person who says Lutherans are liberal, Catholics are nominal. Let me give an example. Baptist view of the sacraments. The street level practice you can observe is Baptists believe that the sacraments are just symbols, and they're not very sacred, and they're not really emphasized, and they're just purely a symbol. They're basically something we do to, like, when you get baptized to show your faith. That's basically what's happening. Well, that may be anecdotally visible, but that is not historic Baptist theology. And I've done a whole video arguing that real presence of Christ in the Eucharist is the historic Baptist view of the Lord's Supper. You can see the thumbnail. You can check that video out if you want. Here, let me talk about baptism, because the way that a Baptist view of baptism is often framed is this. There's, on the one hand, baptismal regeneration, and then on the other hand, the idea that baptism is just a symbol. So you have two options, as you can see on the screen. And basically, on the one side, the baptismal regeneration view is held to be so here it's like baptism isn't just a symbol. Baptism actually saves, and we're told this is explicit in the New Testament. It's unanimous in the Church Fathers, and it's what almost all Christians believe until this recent aberration. And on the other side, you have
Yeah, so I agree with that. I think it ultimately does go down to that, because I think what happens is when you try to sort of have a nuance in between position between baptism saves versus baptism doesn't save, it doesn't do, like, if you're rejecting baptismal regeneration, I think the only option ultimately is that it's just a symbol, right? So when somebody gets baptized, right, for the Baptist, there's nothing objectively happening to where there's something that is prior to that baptism that the person is in to after that person is in, right? He's going to point to Cornelius, and we'll get to those in a second, but that's a problem. Okay, I've talked about this before. I asked him, Dr. Gavin Ortlund, when he and I had lunch at my favorite place called Bluecoast Burrito, and it was the one in Franklin. And so here we are, we're talking, and I hate to be. I'm not the type of person who, when I'm talking with a Baptist friend or a Lutheran or Roman Catholic, I'm like just going to be dogging them on like the things that we're opposed to theologically, right? But I was like, yeah, I do have to ask, So I said, Dr. Ortlund or Dr. I don't remember what I called him. I probably called him Dr. Ortlund. I just have to ask, like, so I started asking questions about like his views on baptism. And at one point, because I don't remember exactly how everything went in the conversation, but like at one point I asked him, I go, so you don't believe that baptism ever regenerates, do you? And he goes, yeah, I don't. He thought for a second, as I recall, and he's like, yeah, I don't, like, it doesn't ever regenerate. And I think that's a problem. Like, that is where it's just a symbol. Talking about the signing and sealing and all that sort of stuff. What does that mean on an objective sense? Now, let's go ahead and move on into this.
The just a symbol view of baptism, which is obviously framed as kind of the cheaper alternative between these two options. Now, the way I would want to push back against this as a way of framing things that leads to a little bit of the contempt and doesn't help us appraise each other at our best is that the framing here is really just giving two options. But as soon as you ask the question, well, how does baptism save? Like, what does that mean? Like, does it happen right when you get baptized? You start to uncover a little bit of complexity, and you see there's actually multiple views of baptismal efficacy actually within those camps, but then also between the just a symbol view on the one hand and baptismal regeneration on the other. Let me put up just another way you could frame it. This is how Francis Turretin basically puts it. He's a Reformed scholastic theologian, and he has basically three options. He uses the phrase sign and seal for his own Reformed view, and he distinguishes that from the Socinian view on the one side, where you have the sacraments as external badges of profession, and on the other side, the Lutheran and Roman Catholic views, which he calls sacraments as vehicles and vessels containing grace and physical means or real and instrumental causes. Now, Turretin's threefold schema there is, of course, not the only way you could frame this. Okay, this is just one other option, but it starts to make visible a little bit of what we actually have to get into in this debate, that there's more than just these two options, baptism, regeneration, and just a symbol. And unfortunately, it's framed like that so much. If you follow these discussions online, people try to make you choose between these two views, and also the complexities within those views are not necessarily unpacked very much. So if you want to recognize that this is more complicated, all you have to do is just start asking about concrete examples.
Right. So he's going to start bringing up examples that I don't think are really good examples of like quote complexity and all, because I think at the end of the day, what he still sort of insists upon, and I don't know why he is insisting upon this, because Dr. Gavin Ortlund has talked to him about this. I'm pretty sure Trent Horn did. I'm sorry, Dr. Jordan Cooper has talked to him about this. I'm pretty sure that Trent Horn, as I recall, does it. And he brings up examples to sort of like, so, hey, they're on my side kind of thing too, that from a Lutheran and a Roman Catholic. I'm like, but what you're not showing complexity, you're just pointing out what baptismal regeneration, the belief is. Baptismal regeneration is not the belief that the only way you can be regenerated is through baptism. And if you are not regenerated through baptism, then you are not regenerated, period. That is not the argument. That has never really been. Now, there are people who say that, right? But that's not baptismal regeneration. You can be saved outside the sacraments, right? We have things like the baptism of desire, the martyr's blood, and all that sort of stuff, right? There have always been those caveats. So this idea that baptismal regeneration is like we all are just under this delusion that baptismal regeneration is only baptism regenerates. It's the only way you can be regenerated, and any other claimed regeneration apart from baptism is false. Like he keeps acting like that's the position we're holding to, and then being like, well, no, look, there are examples where people say otherwise, so therefore it's got to be more nuanced. Like, well, we're already admitting all that. Like that's already what we believe. That's not moving the needle closer to your position. That is just like already within our own position.
Cornelius is of the world. Okay, in Cornelius, Acts chapter 10, Cornelius is speaking in tongues. He has the Holy Spirit. So Peter says, hey, why shouldn't he get baptized? People, this happens a lot. This is my just general observation as a minister. People get the Holy Spirit and are clearly manifesting regeneration prior, temporally, to their baptism. They're speaking in tongues before the baptism, like Cornelius. And then if you just ask about that, you just say, well, how do you explain that? You will get different explanations and different accounts from those who are affirming baptism of regeneration, which is why we actually need to get into this a little bit more and kind of work through this. We have to ask how baptism saves. Here is how Turretin puts it. The question here is not, are the sacraments efficacious? But this is granted on both sides. But how do they exert their efficacy? As physical causes which confer and effect grace, by which an implanted and inborn power? This they maintain. Or as moral causes at whose presence God operates, this we favor. He then identifies another point of distinction between the external act of the sacrament working ex operato, by the work having been done, or you can gloss that a little bit differently, versus the Holy Spirit's attending the external sign. And then he boils it down to the question of whether the sacraments of the New Testament are the true, proper, and immediate causes of justification, which by an efficacy inherent in the signs themselves affect and confer holiness and righteousness upon all receiving the sole external action of a sacrament. Now you can just say Turretin is completely wrong in everything he just said. You can say these distinctions and all these, like the word moral that he just used. You can say all of that is just completely confused, erroneous, whatever. But that would be the argument to make, not just baptism regeneration, just a symbol, take your pick. And the reason is what Turretin is unfolding there in terms of a reformed account of baptismal efficacy, how baptism saves, is broadly followed by the historic.
So here's the thing. Let me give an example, right? So let me think of a good example. So when there's somebody who is on his deathbed, right, and he is like, hey, let's say both Gavin Ortlund and I are dealing with the same person who's on his deathbed, all right. The guy on the deathbed is like, I don't know. I was never baptized, but I would like to, I'm realizing I need to become a Christian and all that sort of stuff. Um, I'm about to die like in a day, kind of thing, and like we know that. Should I even bother getting baptized? Is that something that you think is important, and all that sort of stuff? I would say yes. I think you should try to get baptized here. Let me grab my kit. I've got some holy water that I've got. Um, we can do it now, right? I would be very insistent upon that. I would encourage strongly, and I would say the reason is that objectively, I know that this baptism will regenerate you. I would like to know what Dr. Gavin Ortlund's sort of answer to his question would be instead, right? Maybe not like in response to what I'm saying per se, but like let's say it is two separate sort of issues, right? Or two separate deathbed patients, right? So what would he say to his deathbed patient, and what would I say to mine? I would encourage that man to get baptized. I would baptize him. I'd be like, I'm willing to do it right here, right on the deathbed. What is Dr. Gavin Ortlund going to say to that same person? Because he points out the whole ceremony thing, but like, has he talked? He hasn't talked about that yet. But I'll bring it up now, right? He points to the whole ceremony thing of like, well, it's like your graduation ceremony. I never went to my graduation ceremony. I couldn't care less about my graduation ceremony. The graduation ceremony is just a symbol of your graduation. Like it ultimately is just a symbol of your graduation. It's not. There's nothing that your average university is going to require of you, right? If you're on your deathbed, right? Um, there's no like feel of need of like, oh, well, I need to graduate, I need to go to the ceremony, all that sort of stuff. I feel like his argument about the ceremony thing is really just proving further that it's just a symbol. It is just a symbol when it's a graduation ceremony. Like the ceremony is just a symbol.
Baptists. The Baptists are an extension of the Reformed tradition, and Turretin's view is similar to what you find. Historically, Baptists spoke of baptism as an effective sign, by which language they were rejecting the idea that it's just a symbol. And historically, Baptists spoke of baptism as a sacrament, a means of grace, the meeting place of grace and faith, the objectification of faith and repentance, a sealing of regeneration, often associated.
That is a good point right here. A Reformed Catholic or Catholic says anyone who has read a numerous amount of Reformed authors will know Turretin comes off as having a lower view than others. Yeah, the further you get away from Calvin and the Reformation, the lower the sacramental theology goes. Like you go from Calvin, very high sacramental theology. Heidelberg Catechism is still kind of, and Belgian Confession are still pretty high up there. Scots Confession, very high. Then you get into the 17th century, and the Westminster Confession, London Baptist Confession, much lower. And then you get into like the 19th century with like the Princeton theologians and such. They're driving it dirt poor. Like they are driving it down into the ground as low as possible. So like since the 19th century, this has been even more of a problem. Let's see what we have here. Red. Okay. In my opinion, the reason Dr. Ortlund brings up but these exceptions, which we already affirm, is that there's a deeper soteriological difference, salvation as a moment versus salvation as a process. I wouldn't say necessarily, you can call it a process in some sense. Yeah, sure. The confessional documents of the Reformed speak higher to the sacraments than Turretin. Oh, yeah, by far. Yeah, definitely.
Associated with assurance of salvation and a further endowment of the Spirit. You can gather something of this in the Baptist theologian Henry Lawrence's treatment and the way he distinguishes word and sacrament here. The word especially teacheth, the sacraments especially seal and confirm. The word indeed signifies and applies spiritual things, but the sacraments more efficaciously represent and apply. So here you've got both word and sacrament, both giving grace, both means of grace. Baptism isn't.
But he keeps talking about represents and stuff like that. But anyway,
just a symbol. And in fact, it is sealing and confirming what the word has done. Now, someone might say, well, sealing and confirming, that's not a big deal. That's not that much. That's just, but the thing is, this is the same kind of language that the Lutheran scholastic theologians will use to describe what they regard as the exceptional cases, which almost all proponents of baptismal regeneration can affirm, namely where God regenerates a person prior to their baptism. Here's the great Lutheran theologian, Johann Gerhard. When, therefore, they are baptized who have already been regenerated through the word as a spiritual seed, they have no need of regeneration through baptism, but in them, baptism is a confirmation and sealing of regeneration. Sounds a lot like
So he points to Johann Gerhard, and then he points to Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas. So here's what I brought up before, and I'm going to bring it up again over here. So this is a very important thing to bring up. I think Dr. Gavin Ortlund has a very different understanding of regeneration from what we do. And the reason I think that is he points out, well, look, Cornelius is regenerated, and I've just seen this so many times where people are regenerated before baptism. I have never. I don't think you can say that. Like, how do I know somebody is regenerated? Have they been baptized? Then I know that they're regenerated, right? Now I've not looked up these quotes from either Gerhard or St. Thomas Aquinas, but I imagine because just this is sort of how I would argue. So and maybe I'm wrong or whatever, but it's not they're saying, well, we know this person is regenerated, but because we see it or whatever. It's just that this baptism is now doing a sort of like signing and sealing of it. It's talking in the hypothetical, right? So it's kind of think of the idea of like vaccines are a bit controversial nowadays and all that fun stuff, so don't take this in it's just the first analogy that comes to mind, so anti-vax people don't freak out about this, right? But let's say I have been diagnosed with some deadly disease, and there's a vaccination or some sort of cure that happens, and there's no side effects, like bad side effects to it, right? It's just it's something that will actually cure me of the disease, right? Let's say there are no symptoms to it either, right? Or maybe some of the symptoms, maybe there are some symptoms, but like it doesn't mean that it's not there just because there are no symptoms or something like that. Let's give that. So let's say I'm just no longer showing the symptoms. Does that mean that the doctor necessarily knows for sure that because I'm not showing those symptoms, therefore I don't have the disease anymore? Well, he's going to have to do a check. Maybe let's say he can't like do a check for whatever reason at this point. And he's like, well, we need to get this cure in him just in case kind of thing right away kind of thing, right? That's more akin to what's being talked about. As I would sort of understand it, or at least how I would answer it, right? If I'm talking, so we have a couple at the church who are not baptized. They grew up Baptist, believe it or not. Yep, they grew up Baptist and were never baptized. It's a sadly common story. I know quite a few like that. They're great people, and hopefully this is not like they're wonderful people, and I'm glad that they're coming here and we're getting that all settled with them, right? So this is not a critique on them at all. Like my whole point, my whole looking at them and all that sort of stuff is, well, look, when I told them, I said, what baptism is going to do here is like, for sure that you are regenerated with baptism. So prior to baptism, you may come to receive a blessing for Holy Communion, but you cannot receive Holy Communion. And they've taken that very well. They've been wonderful. They're just wonderful people. That's what we're looking at with this. We're not looking because I feel like Dr. Gavin Ortlund, if someone's not baptized, would you give them Holy Communion? And I think you would have to say you would if you feel like they're regenerated, because there's nothing in Scripture explicitly saying that like you need baptism before receiving Holy Communion. But like that's the tradition of the church. That's sort of, this isn't another one of those things, right? When you're constantly having to redefine the sort of basic understanding of the scriptures and the history of the church, and that all these sorts of problems come out. Now it's like, and I've met people who are like this, evangelicals, who are like, yeah, you can receive Holy Communion even though you've not been baptized yet, because you're regenerated because you love Jesus. Well, I'm sorry, but like I know atheists who love Jesus. That's not enough.
What Lawrence just said. And other Lutherans will have a similar conception. I don't think that's an eccentricity in Gerhard. Francis Pieper has a similar idea that regeneration can happen prior to baptism. And when that is the case, baptism then is the confirmation and sealing of regeneration. That's very similar to a Baptist view. Thomas Aquinas actually has a similar approach he frames it all differently in the Summa Theologica, but he also allows for regeneration prior to your baptism by water. And he frames that in terms of a baptism of desire. So Henry Lawrence there is just one example of dozens and dozens of historic Baptists on this point. You could look through Stan Fowler's book, More Than a Symbol: The British Baptist Recovery of Baptismal Sacramentalism. A lot of people are just ignorant of this whole tradition of Baptist thought. And so I would just encourage us. This is a way, just like if you want to be fair to Lutherans, you need to say, well, hey, I may have seen a lot of liberal Lutherans, but there's a lot more out there. Or fair to Catholics or whatever, you might want to say, hey, I can't just go by what I saw in my little community over here. I got to look at the full picture historically and globally. Let's do the same with Baptists and other low church expressions of Protestant Christianity so we can frame this better and basically just be more fair. Final point. Why might someone believe this whole idea that baptism, let's say we go with Turretin's threefold conceptual framework. Okay, baptismal regeneration, it's the cause. The putting on of the water in the name of the Trinity causes that which it signifies. You got that over here. On the other hand, you got it's just a symbol, just a bare memorial. And then in the middle, you've got his language of sign and seal. It is efficacious unto salvation, but not as cause. Okay, why might someone go with that middle category? Well, if you want to see a full case for this, I've done a lot of videos on this as well as some dialogues, one with Jordan Cooper, one with Trent Horn. Those might be of interest. Or if you just want to get a more succinct argument, I think I did a video in March 2022 on this you could look up. But let me just put up a summary, just flagging some of the points. Number one, continuity with prior revelation. Okay, this understanding of sacramental efficacy is very similar to what we see with circumcision. Circumcision does not cause the person to have a circumcised heart. Physical circumcision does not cause that.
So the antitype always is greater than the type, right? The circumcision points forward to Christ's work, right? But also to baptism itself, right? Although that's not the primary argument I would use. I would not use necessarily the sort of circumcision parallel. It's useful, don't get me wrong, but that's not the one I would primarily use. There are more obvious explicit passages like, well, the crossing of there's the crossing of the Red Sea. There is the flood, right? These all point to baptism saving. And this is sort of one of the issues I have with a lot of the Baptist arguments is that, like, whenever there are arguments against baptismal regeneration, they are never about what the scriptures actually say that baptism is and does. It's always about these other passages that are not about what baptism is and what baptism does. I got on this part, but Gottschalk, what do you talk about? Which one's the wild statement? If you could let me know. So it's always about, well, what about Cornelius? What about this, and that? I go, well, like, none of those things actually argue against what we're saying. Cornelius being regenerated prior to baptism is not an argument that baptism therefore doesn't save. One of the ways I learned about these sorts of things was with a lot of Lutheran stuff. So like Lutheran YouTube channels. So what was his name? Reverend Jonathan Fisk, I think is his name. He said something that in one of his videos that really stuck to me. That really helped me when I was going through these issues. His channel was called Worldview Everlasting. This is like 10, 15 years ago now. He goes, look, if I am at a pool and somebody's drowning, and somebody who is not a lifeguard saves that person, does that now mean that the phrase lifeguards save is false? Like, because I found an example of somebody who, presuming that, like, on average at the pool, it's the lifeguards who are doing the saving, but in one instance, somebody before gets there before the lifeguard, right? Or even if it's the majority, that doesn't mean lifeguards don't save. It's like, that's the whole thing. It's I actually, I think even a better, well, never mind, we'll just get to it. But my whole point is that, like, Cornelius doesn't prove anything wrong. Now, I actually brought this up in my Sunday school class that I teach, where I point out, we're doing the early church, so I'm starting off with Pentecost and then sort of going into the extra biblical sort of stuff. But I talk about these, and this is something I learned actually from Dr. Jordan Cooper a few years ago. I don't remember being talked about this in anything about Acts, but the reality of these like little mini Pentecosts that are happening. Now I'm aware of it, like Cornelius and stuff like that, but like I didn't realize that the sort of better frame to look through that with is this idea that these are mini Pentecosts of like, well, here are the Samaritans. They're now allowed to be part of the family of God. That's what the Spirit is trying to prove, or what the Spirit is showing to the apostles. That's the Gentiles. Look, the Gentiles are allowed to be part of the family of God and all that sort of stuff, right? So that's the point of it. Now, how does the Spirit do that? The Spirit does that by regenerating them, right? And then they're like, well, we need to tie baptism to that right quick and in a hurry, right? So yeah.
But neither is it just a symbol. That's one thing I talk about in those videos. Number 2, the book of Acts. Whenever you see baptism in a concrete, actual occurrence, it never causes salvation. Nowhere. I've mentioned Cornelius already, but you can go through every other example, including Paul.
But literally every single passage about baptism that talks about what baptism does ties it to salvation. Baptism saves. Baptism is, as many of you as have been baptized, have been buried with Christ, right? We're united to the death of Christ in our baptism. That's Romans 6, right? The washing of regeneration. Baptism for the forgiveness of sins. Unless you're born of water and spirit, you cannot see the kingdom of God. All these sorts of things, right? They're all pointing to baptism. And no, there's not a spirit baptism and a water baptism. There's one Lord, one faith, one baptism. So we don't get to make all these different types of baptisms in our theology, where there's a water baptism and a spirit baptism and a hula hoop baptism. And no, you don't get to do that. There is John's baptism, which is pre-Christian, right? That's the preparation for it, right? And then Christ's baptism, Trinitarian baptism, the one baptism, the one baptism Christians are supposed to perform. That is the thing that saves. It is water and the Spirit, water and the Word.
When Ananias lays on his hands on him, the Spirit descends, he receives his sight, Acts 9:17-18. Then he rises up and is subsequently baptized. Okay, that's not an instrumental means of salvation. I need to say this because of how much condescension comes against us. We're trying to read the book of Acts, and every single time baptism occurs, it never is evident as a cause of regeneration. Number 3, so also after the book of Acts in life today. I just meet Cornelius after Cornelius after Cornelius after Cornelius. They are speaking in tongues and worshiping Jesus and giving every fruit of regeneration prior to their baptism while they're still in the catechetical process. So I'm going to treat them as regenerate because that's what I think they are.
All right, if you're going to treat them as regenerate, then that means by that logic, you have to say that they should receive Holy Communion. And if you're going to treat them as regenerate, then like it seems like baptism is useless at that point. Like, why go to the ceremony then? I think I'm really appreciative of the fact that he brought up that one, because when I heard that with his discussion with Dr. Cooper, I was like, that is one of the like most obvious examples of it being just a symbol. Like, I think maybe it's I don't know what it is, right? Maybe it's just me being whatever, but like, I had no desire whatsoever to go to my graduation whatsoever. It was just a symbol to me. Like, I couldn't care less. So, like, what is the argument against that? Like, let's put it this way. Suppose you are, I don't know if Dr. Ortlund does. I don't think he does any sort of college sort of ministry stuff, right? Suppose you are talking to two students, right? One student says, I really don't care about taking my final, right? I'm just going to skip going to my final. Right? You want to graduate, right? Yeah, but like, I'm going to go to the ceremony. I'm just going to go to the ceremony, and there's my graduation, right? Hopefully, rightly, he would say, no, you still need to do that, right? But if you have another student says, like, I'm going to ace this final, and he's demonstrated, and you have every confidence, he's like, he's studied it all up, right? But then he's like, I'm not going to go to the ceremony. Well, Dr. Gavin Ortlund's not going to have anything close to the same sort of response of like, no, you should go to the ceremony. You should even if he's like, you worked hard for it, right? He's like, I don't care. He's going to be probably going to eventually drop it. He's not going to actually like risk losing this friendship or not friendship, but like this mentorship and all that sort of stuff. Let's say it's his own children, right? If the child is like, I don't want to walk, I don't care, I think it's stupid. I'd rather actually go on this trip that a bunch of us are doing go to England or whatever kind of thing. I think that's even more important because I'd rather go to England than go to my graduation service. Hopefully, I like at least I'd be like, yeah, that's fine. We you can do that instead, kind of thing, right? Um, that would be different. Like it's a world of difference between like not even showing up to your final for your last year in graduation for whatever, however many classes, for any of the classes, right? Versus not showing up to your ceremony. There's going to be no negative impact upon your academic life by not showing up to your ceremony. None. So it's very much a symbol, is my point. It's literally just a symbol. And so I don't understand how this is a sign and seal in this understanding. Whoops. How did I get? Oh, my mother uses mine.
So also after the book of Acts in Life Today, I just beat.
So my mother uses my my YouTube because it's no commercials and all that sort of stuff. And so I accidentally just clicked on a Prince Harry video that she apparently was watching. Anyway, whatever. Let's move on.
Cornelius after Cornelius after Cornelius after Cornelius, they are speaking in tongues and worshiping Jesus and giving every fruit of regeneration prior to their baptism while they're still in the catechetical process. So I'm going to treat them as regenerate because that's what I think they are. Number 4 is just the question of what a sacrament is. A sacrament is a representative, symbolical, public act. It's not just a sign, but it is a signifying event. And so you have to ask the question of what's the relationship between the sign and the thing signified. And I've used the word metonymy, which means part for the whole. People get a little lost on this. It's pretty simple, really. It's just like if I say the blood of Jesus saves. The word blood does not mean blood versus the flesh. It means blood is representative of the larger complex of events we associate with Jesus' death on the cross. Similarly, when we say baptism saves, we don't mean baptism as distinct from the prior conversion. We just mean as the public representation of this.
The blood of Christ is not the public representation of his death, right? We actually believe that he needs to have shed his blood. Your position is literally that the water baptism quote, and I'm using that just because people, kind of thing, but the actual water of the baptism does not need to be there. It does not, it has no effect. It literally has no effect upon your salvation. Again, going back to that ceremony analogy, there is no need to go to the ceremony. The ceremony is just a representation, and that is all that it is. It's just, there's no power in baptism that I can point to within the Baptist theology. It does nothing. It does absolutely nothing. So, yeah.
Because it's a public expression of salvation, it's totally sensible that baptism would function like that. And I've given metaphors. Graduation ceremony. Okay, you can say I graduated on May 4th because that's when you walked across the stage and got handed your diploma. That's the visible public expression. But technically, for job application purposes, you already did graduate when you finished the coursework. Or the coronation service of a monarch. You can say, a new king or queen will be formally and publicly recognized as the new monarch. Typically, the crown is placed upon their head. There are oaths. There's anointing with oil. There's formal clothing, solemn declarations, all this ritual that is the public formal expression of it. But technically, it doesn't cause them to be the monarch. Technically, they already were the monarch earlier than that. And I've talked about these. So but you can still say I graduated on May 13th, or you can still say during the formal act of the coronation service, we recognize so-and-so as the new king and so on and so forth.
Yeah, but baptism is just a play act for the Baptist theology, is my point. Is that when you have this idea, it's just a play act. It's nothing else. It's just it is literally just a ceremony for like, and I'm not trying to be talking down or anything like that. I just do not see how it can be anything other than just a symbol, just a ceremony. I really am not seeing the difference, right? If it has no power to convert the soul, if it has no power to regenerate, if it has no power to do anything, if it's literally just okay, here, if we're using the sign and seal sort of thing, right? Well, that's all that it is, right? The sign and seal of a jar of pickles saying, hey, it's made fresh, doesn't cause it to be made fresh. That's not what we believe. There's no, it's just a symbol then. Like that sign and seal is just a symbol, right? It might quote keep it like as a seal, it might keep it fresh, right? And that's maybe the closest you can get. But I don't think he would even say that. I don't think he would say that like you being baptized lets you keep your regeneration. I don't think he would say that.
The fifth argument I've given is that faith also saves. And so you have two causes with one effect, faith and baptism. They both save. But faith and baptism don't happen at the same time for the vast majority of people. So right there, you're into it. And you got to say, okay, wait a second. If my next door neighbor becomes a Christian on Wednesday and gets baptized on Sunday, and he's not regenerated until baptism, if that's the cause, then now I've got to find a way to interpret the language of faith being salvific for Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And so that right there, again, this isn't that complicated. And I have a lot more to say about the biblical language about saving water and how complicated that is. It's not just baptism. The baptism participates in that imagery, and that's from the Old Testament, from books like Ezekiel and so on and so forth. So I go into all that in those videos. All I'm trying to say right now is there's a little more rigor to that theology than is often recognized. And it would be good if people would engage that more. And if you criticize its best expressions and don't just lob grades at just a symbol view. Because, as I said, I mentioned at the end, it is the low church expressions of Christianity that are really growing the most right now. In fact, they're the only ones that aren't shrinking, frankly. So that's something.
So first of all, that's not true. The ACNA is growing, and various other traditional Anglican churches are growing. My own parish is growing. I've seen it real in my own life, right? That there just every Anglican church that I have been a part of I've seen growth. Like literally every single Anglican church, whether I've been a parishioner or a clergyman, there's just been constant growth, right? One exception, I won't name it, but there's one exception to that, and I think that there were some issues with that priest in charge. And now, actually, I will say that that priest, I've seen growth with that priest in his church. But no, I just constantly see the growth, like their growth in like the traditional Roman Catholic churches, like the SSPX and stuff like that. Like there's just this constant growth in these various groups. Now, here's the thing, though. I think there's a major problem with like, well, look, they're growing, therefore they're good. I don't think that's a good way to do this. There was a time when Mormon churches were growing. I think they're shrinking now, but they were growing immensely. Does that mean that they're good? Mohammedanism is growing. Does that mean it's good? Right? And I'm using extreme examples just to point out the sort of error in this mindset. Because no, I'm not going to say that non-denoms are as bad as the Mohammedans or the Mormons, but I do, again, that goes back to the very beginning of this video, I do think that there's a major significant issue with the Baptist-costal sort of mindset approach. And this is where I'm going to get into the worship part. Now, let me see if I should, let's see, do I have it here? All right. Do I make any other? Okay. So I'm going to read this. This is a comment I made about a week ago. As you pointed out, this is on Dr. Gavin Ortlund's video, right? As you pointed out, it definitely can go in the other direction. When I was a Baptist, this was our attitude towards high church Christians, and worse, we considered them not Christian. That's what I grew up in as a fundamentalist. One of my biggest issues with the evangelical tradition is its form of worship. It is seeker sensitive and focuses only upon the intellect and the emotions. Yes, these are generalizations. These practices are, I humbly submit, incredibly damaging to the Church Catholic. Edit. I made this as I was watching it, this first part, if I recall correctly, and I think I made the rest of this at the very, very end. So, edit. I have a few concerns with this video, and I say this as someone who respects you and your work. One, you constantly point to the narratives that happen in Acts, but not to what the actual teachings are on baptism every single time. Without exception, someone in Scripture teaches us what baptism does. He teaches it's salvific. Two, showing people being regenerated apart from baptism is no more in denial of baptism regeneration than showing people being saved from the pool by non-lifeguards means lifeguards don't save. Three, you seem to have an understanding of regeneration that focuses upon enthusiasm. That's one thing I forgot to point out, where you're less likely to, it seems, consider someone regenerated because he is more stoic. I found this incredibly concerning. Let's only park on that a little bit because I didn't talk about this earlier. He has this sort of idea of like regeneration being like, well, they're happier and they're speaking in tongues, and I never spoke in tongues like upon salvation. Does that mean I'm not saved? I'm not regenerated? This is why the objectivity of baptism is so important. It's like, how do you know somebody is regenerated? How do I know? Because they were baptized. Like, it's as simple as that. I don't need to be like, well, they had a day where they had 70% no sin and 30% with sin. Like what? How are you supposed to measure that? Or they were excited to the well. I've met some happy atheists. Like all of this sort of like feelings and emotions and all this sort of and like they really talked about praising Jesus. I know people who have had that. Like, what does Scripture itself say? Right? Think about the parable of the sower. The person who's like all excited about the faith and everything, and then they fall away. Like, is that are you going to say, Gavin? Now, I could say within that there can be regeneration in that in my own theology. I'm not sure you can say that because if they're ultimately not elect, you would say that I think you would say that they cannot have ever been regenerated and they never can be regenerated if they are not elect. Where in my own theology, Lutheran theology, Augustinian theology, I think even Calvin, I would say I would argue even Calvin himself, you can be regenerated without being elect. Number 4. The growth of non-denominationalism is honestly very concerning precisely because it is so entertainment-oriented and so weak on the sacraments. Also, I speak anecdotally here, the traditional Anglican parishes I'm aware of constantly see growth. My own parish has grown from about 15 people at the beginning of last year to 40 to 50 a Sunday today. We had 2 families out. If both of those families were here this past Sunday, with both services, we have morning prayer and adult formation, and then we have Holy Communion. We would have had almost 60 people. With that, we had about almost 40 people. Yeah, so we're seeing major growth. And we're getting more people to come and all that sort of stuff. Like I just constantly see growth in traditional Anglican parishes. This goes back to the other issue with worship, which I really want to park on and probably end with. So I believe that the contemporary form of worship is actually damaging to the church and damaging to the soul. It teaches fundamentally that worship is about how you feel. Worship is about your feelings. Worship is about catering to your needs. Worship is about your expression, not worship is the giving of yourself to God. That is what worship is. Worship is giving yourself to God. And I think I'm done. I don't think there's anything else there. So let me just get back to this. Worship is giving of yourself to God. And that's what it's our duty every Sunday to worship. So when we try to make it into the contemporary with the band and all that sort of stuff, we are really trying to turn it into an entertainment venue. And maybe this is my snob-nosedness, right? It's been a little bit better to do it within liturgy, a liturgical sort of thing. But I actually get very angry whenever I go to a non-denominational church and experience their worship. It actually angers me. And I remember there was a time, and this is not very long ago, this is when I was in college, so it was about, 12, 13 years ago, I want to say, 12 years ago, 13, where it was the exact opposite. I was going to the big megachurch, the Southern Baptist megachurch, and I brought my friend Stefan. I was like, hey, you got to experience our church. It's not like other churches, like that whole shtick. And I remember looking at Stefan while I was, doing the hand waving and worshiping and all that sort of stuff. And he was just like this the entire time. And I could tell he was sort of like not liking it. And I thought, oh, he's just not filled with the Spirit, kind of thing. And now it's kind of almost more the opposite, right? I'm looking at this and it's so catering to the emotions. so trying to get you to have a feeling and experience. And that is so anti what worship is. Worship is not about your experience. Worship is not about how you feel. Worship is about God. This is why I never have to, in my liturgy, tell everybody, hey, just to remind you, this is not about us, it's about him. Pretty much every service I've ever been to that's a non-denominational or that's a modern evangelical type of worship, the singer has had to say that. And there's a reason the singer has had to say that. The singer has had to say that because everything in their liturgy is screaming, it is all about you. It is all about you. And that's what gets me so frustrated. It is, I'm very tempted to say blasphemous. Like, not say blasphemies. I'm saying that it is blasphemous because it is just such an anti-biblical understanding of worship. So like, it's not that there are drums. I've seen liturgy with drums and I kind of roll my eyes and all that, but like, okay, it's fine, whatever. Just not a big fan of it. Like, they're worshiping still. They're authentically worshiping. I just don't like the usage of those instruments for particular reasons, right? I think it still does sort of cater somewhat to it, but it's not going so full blown into it. When you've got the band front and center, you're telling everybody this is what's most important. When you've got front and center the preacher with his TED Talk, you're telling the church this is what's most important. When we are doing worship, if you've not been to a liturgical worship service, I really highly encourage it. Do a high church liturgy one, all right? Not something that's sort of half baking it kind of thing. Everything is set aside to the side. What is at the center? The center is the gospel. That's read from the center, often from the midst of the people, and the sacrament. That the altar and the sacrament, right? The gospel and then the altar with the sacrament. That's always at the center. Even when I preach, I've never been to an Anglican service, an Anglican worship service, where they preach from the middle. They preach from the side. Because everything is about Jesus. Everything is about going to God, right? That is what it's about. But everything in the liturgy of, like, do a liturgical assessment. I need to do that. I need to make up like a liturgical assessment sheet. That's what I think that's a project I'm going to do. A liturgical assessment sheet to be like, is your worship God honoring? Well, let's check. And you can just go through this list. What's front and center? What do you think that is telling your congregation is most important? Are the lights constantly dimmed? Can you hear the others singing along with you? Why can you not hear the others singing along with you? Why is it more important to hear the instruments than it is to hear your fellow believers worshiping God, if that is indeed what they are doing? It's just like there's so many issues. It's not, because again, and I'm going to reiterate this, it's not your fundamentalist Baptist. Well, they got drums, and if you spell drums backwards and invert it and do it in Swahili, then it's the number 666. Like, there's nothing like that. That's not what I'm talking about. There are severe fundamental issues with the Jesus movement, seeker-sensitive movement from the 70s that is totally perverted. And that's not too weak. It might be, or too strong. I mean, that's not too strong word. I will say without question, it is a perversion of worship, right? And I don't see that being corrected by Baptists, by and large. Even the people who are most faithful, or claiming to be, most mature, all that sort of stuff, right? I don't see this being corrected by them. It's still this sort of concert venue, or maybe they get rid of the drums. It's still just hymns and a sermon and like pass the plate like you would with offering, but instead with like the Holy Communion kind of thing, right? Um, there's no desire for actually having meaning to worship, whereas the devotion of oneself to God. It is about receive, receive, receive. That's all, not submit, devote, and through that devotion and submission, I receive. That's not how it is, and it's very troubling. Like, so I think that there is a fundamental issue with how evangelicals, and this goes back to the Puritan tradition. It's not just something that's like just the Jesus movement and all that sort of stuff. When you make worship should involve the entirety of oneself. So it's not that there should be no emotions. Emotions should be involved. It should not just be just emotions. That's what the modern American church is dealing with, right? The sort of Baptist-costal sort of thing. It's not a pure intellectual thing. That's one of the issues I have with the Presbyterians. It tends to be just head knowledge in worship. It's really just sort of head knowledge. So you're listening to a 45-minute lecture with some Psalter reading, singing, and stuff like that, right? It is the fullness of oneself. There are movements, there are actions, there are calls and responses. There's an engagement of oneself with the with the church in offering ourselves to God. And it is emotional, it is intellectual, it is bodily, it's spirit, it's all of it put together. So basically that's it. Let me go ahead and see. There are a lot of things. Oh, it's already 2:30. I gotta make a call in half an hour. I am debating. Okay, if you want to resend yours as a super chat, I'll be able to go right away. I don't know if I'll be able to go through all these, but there are so many. We'll start way back here, I think is where we were at last. Oh my goodness, there are so many. Let me just go from the bottom up. Let's do that. Corrective measures are hard, even in Baptist churches where leaders want to implement them. In the end, it's congregational polity, and they 100% will rise up against reforms if they don't like it. The Puritans said you should be excited to hear the 4-hour sermon. All modern evangelicals do is make the thing they have to do to show election something they liked. Yeah. Dr. Decapod, I feel from the deepness of my heart that they shall not claim that, and my heart is a super scientific method for knowing. I feel like I'm going into. There are so many ones. I don't think I'll be able to get into them all. I'll sort of look and see what kind of average ones we can look at, sort of thing. If anything pops out, I'm like, oh, that's really good. Hello, Father James and all. Yesterday I couldn't watch the live stream with the other gentleman. By the way, his channel is pretty good. Yeah, it's a good channel. Definitely go watch it. Father James, Rayleigh Protestant. Gavin says the sacraments are more than mere signs. Okay, Gavin, what is the something more? He can't actually say. He doesn't know what the something more is. Yeah, hopefully that you understood that. That's what I was saying. Like, the whole point is that, like, you're saying it's doing something beyond just showing salvation. What is that thing that it is doing? Yes. The Reformed branch is the branch that the Mormons, J-Dubs, SD, and most of the other modern heresy groups rose out of. Yeah, that's actually interesting. Yeah, that's true. Yes. Jesus makes numerous references to Ecclesiasticus and Sirach in his many pithy sayings. Yes, that's true. And when someone doesn't like it, they doubt my salvation. That's Puritan said you should be excited. Okay. So yeah, that's basically it. I have to get back. The office hours start at 2. I was hoping to get this done in an hour. It took an hour and a half. It was longer than I expected. But yeah, I don't know if Dr. Gavin Ortlund's going to watch this. I mean, it's an hour and a half, so I apologize if you're watching through this, Dr. Gavin Ortlund. But like, yeah, this is what I believe. I think these are major issues. I think it's not just like, and part of it, one other thing that I forgot to bring up, and I really got to get going, but whatever. There is this reality that we have to deal with as Anglicans, where we're constantly having to defend ourselves against claims by Roman Catholics that we're all just like you guys, the Baptists. And we're like, no, like, that's not what we believe. And there's a reason for that. Like, I would rather someone be a Roman Catholic than be a Baptist. And I don't again, that just shows how far off the Baptists are from the reservation. They're just so removed from the historic Christian faith that it goes back to Luther, what he says, like, I would rather have blood with the papists than wine with the enthusiasts. Um, when you are attacking baptismal regeneration, infant baptism, the real and we didn't even get to that. I don't know quite Dr. Gavin Ortlund's position, but if any claim of real presence that denies that Christ is bodily present, like that you're receiving the body and blood of Christ, is not an actual real presence. It's really just like, well, there's just a spiritual happy thing that happens, kind of thing. That's a problem. So maybe he doesn't. Maybe he believes that you're actually receiving the body and blood of Christ substantially, the substance of the body and blood of Christ, right? As Calvin says, right? So if he says that, that's fine. I don't know. But a lot of Baptists, even the ones who are like, well, I'm sacramental and all sorts of stuff, they tend to be more like, I mean, think of James White. James White will deny that Christ is bodily present in the Eucharist. I'm like, well, that's not real presence then. Like you are, it's just a symbol for you. It really is just a symbol for you. And so, there's all that sort of stuff, right? We barely touched on it, the Congregationalist sort of thing, which encourages schism. It encourages schism, right? When you have all these issues, it is really, 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 really hard to be like, yeah, but these aren't significant differences. And he points out, he admits, like, yeah, we need to be like, there are significant differences. It's not like I'm not trying to paper over them and all that sort of stuff. I go, yeah, it's the arrogance of the Baptist theology, where everybody before us got all these things wrong: ecclesiology, baptism, the Eucharist, how salvation works, right? Like everything. It's just like, I don't see how you are a reform. I see how you are a restoration, where you believe that the church was destroyed, essentially, and that we had to restore the church. But I do not see how this is reform. So that's it. It just, I made a few notes, but there was a lot of just my thoughts as we were going through. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope this was helpful. I just want to encourage the Baptists, the Evangelicals, the non-denoms, all of you guys, recognize that you are swimming in water. And my reference to that is sort of the idea of, like, fish don't know what water is, because it's the air they breathe, right? Your way of doing worship, and that's one of the biggest things for me, like, because I'm a big proponent of proper worship. The way you do worship, it is hard for me to call that biblical. I don't think it's biblical. That needs, like, we'll deal with the sacraments and all that sort of stuff as well, right? But the worship part is just so important. I feel like I hear somebody, so I got to get going. Hope you'll have a good day. God bless.